And we're going to go two more psych perspectives today. We've got humanistic psychology and cognitive psychology. All right, humanistic psychology was created as a result of the previous two psych perspectives. Okay? So again, we're progressing chronologically. This is about the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s. This is the time period we're looking at a lot with humanistic psychology. There are still remnants of it today, so it hasn't necessarily fallen away like introspection structuralism. So it's created as a response to psychoanalysis and behaviorism. These psychologists didn't like the negativity associated with psychoanalysis and didn't like the idea that behaviorism, there's no control, that you as a human being have no control over what happens. They didn't necessarily, these humanistic psychologists didn't agree with that idea. Okay? So it does quite the opposite. It focuses on the uniqueness of human beings and their ability to make decisions. So again, free will, no free will. These guys believe that there's a lot of free will, right? This time, with this perspective, I reflect upon it a lot of times. I think of it more like your warm, fuzzy feeling approach to psychology, right? Your warm, fuzzy feeling approach to psychology. There are two psychologists that I want you to be familiar with, just like with behaviorism, and we need to differentiate them just a little bit. You have Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. This is Rogers here, and this is Maslow here. Okay, we'll start with Carl Rogers. I think a lot of us are probably more familiar with his ideas than Maslow. Carl Rogers was a guy that came up with and a big proponent of group therapy. Group therapy. So people that are struggling with certain types of disorders and predominantly addicts, right? Addictions. What you do is put them together in a group, and they could talk about their faults, their failures, right? The things that they struggle with, and then they could develop some accountability with one another. And through that type of setting, that would help them to overcome their deficiencies. So anybody think of anything come to mind as I described group therapy that you may be familiar with? People getting together, they almost like set up in a circle. I always visualize a circle, right? What would it be?
Alcohol Anonymous.
Yes, Alcoholics Anonymous. So you may want to write that down as an example. That does a really good job of exemplifying this idea of group therapy. What is it?
What about in Wreck-It Ralph?
I'm not familiar with this one.
Yeah, that's
Oh yeah, that's definitely.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, they like.
What is it that they struggle with?
It's the villain.
Oh, it's the
Being
bad
guy.
guys.
It's the bad guys.
They're bad guys, and they're bad guys, and they want to be good guys.
Okay, all right. They can't.
They can't.
They struggle with the temptation of doing evil. All right. So they got to have some type of accountability.
With temptation. It was just everyone hated them because they were bad guys
Okay.
in the game, but they weren't bad guys in real life.
Uh huh.
So they're like labeled.
Uh huh.
And so they were
That relates a little bit more to sociology with the labeling theory and deviance. Maybe I could do something with that later on. That's good stuff. But it can be applied to other things. I know that our counselors in the past, it's been quite a few years since we had a particular counselor that used it, but they would use group therapy and group counseling sessions for students that were struggling, with different types of things, with emotions, relationships, stress of academics, and it works really well, right? Because people can share their experiences with others. Knowing that somebody else is struggling really helps an individual out. All right, the other guy, Abraham Maslow, came up with this concept. Okay, now I kind of want you to cover this up and erase this idea of self-transcendence. The top of the hierarchy that I want you to remember is this. So there will be a test question about this concept of self-actualization. So just remember that self-actualization is at the top of this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It does say modified hierarchy. His was really just self-actualization. Okay? His idea is really based off of this theory that each one of us, no matter who we are born with this innate desire to become the best person possible. that we could possibly become. Okay? The best person possible. And that would be labeled, according to this theory, of reaching self-actualization. Okay? So we all have this motivation, this desire to be the best that we can be. However, because of environment, things that are around us, relationships that we have, sometimes we're not able to reach that. But we're constantly trying to work our way up. Okay? So he says you've got to pass through all these tiers before you can reach self-actualization. And he says that really, many of us, the majority of us, we never do get there. There's actually a very small percentage of the population ever gets to self-actualization. I think some of the examples that he had was like Mahatma Gandhi, right? Or Eleanor Roosevelt, those things. Yes?
How can he know, like, what was his definition of self-actualization? Because everyone's self-actualization is different, and even though they may seem like they have reached that, maybe inside they're like, oh, I still haven't done this.
Right. So he would do like, from my perspective, looking, how did he label them as being self-actualized? I think he would just reflect upon what were they able to achieve in their achievements. What are they? Are they selfish achievements? Are they achievements for the good of mankind? And if you really look at like Gandhi, if you look at Eleanor Roosevelt, right, the things that they did was not necessarily for self, it was for others, right? So the other thing that you need to keep in mind that kind of brings that up, this is a very good question, Mr. Meredith, it's fluid, right? It's going up and going down, right? It's not like I reach self-actualization, boom, done, I don't have to work anymore, I'm there for the duration of my life, okay? It doesn't happen that way. He says that if you ever get something deprived of yourself, all of a sudden you go back down to that particular spot. You got to take care of that first before you can move back up the ladder. So the bottom is physiological needs. That's like food and water, right? You got to take care of those things first. Okay. Then it's security needs. You got to make sure that you are in a safe environment. Social needs. Your relationships have to be healthy relationships. Then you can think about esteem. Esteem needs, having a positive self-concept, and then you can get to self-actualization there. Okay? I want you to think about some students and academics education. I know that our environment, for the most part, is fairly healthy, positive environment here in our Eureka High School community. It may differ a little bit if you say go to like District 150. Okay? We had some students go over to one of the schools in Peoria quite a few years ago.
My sister's one.
Yeah, she was. And so she came back and she told us about one thing. I think it was like a Friday before a long weekend. And as the students were walking out, the faculty was sitting there by the doors, and they just had bags and bags of food, like grocery bags of food. And what was happening is the students, as they walked out, they were just taking bags. They didn't have to pay for them anything, right? And the reason why the school was doing that, providing that for them, because they knew that those students, when they left, there wasn't anybody there that was going to give them anything over that duration of that long weekend, right? So if you really think about it, would those students be able to perform very well academically? According to this theory, they're constantly down here at the physiological needs. There's no way, right, that they're going to be able to perform at a high level academically if they can't get those needs met first. Okay? Maybe I'll talk more about this a little bit later. This guy I heard talk from Northwestern University just a couple weeks ago. He came out with a book, and I think it's over at the public library. He was talking about marriage, and he says that I think it's called the All or Nothing Marriage. And he did a historical overview of marriage. And he says, what marriage used to be is much different than what it is today. We have put so much on marriage that our expectations are so much that sometimes it falls apart because of our high expectations. And when he was going back through it, he was looking at the progression. It was just following these same steps of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You got to meet the most basic needs, and then move up, move up, and move up. And what has happened today is our expectations with marriage, according to his theory, is that we think about esteem and self-actualization. We want the best of the best, and if it's not that, then we give up on it, right? It's the all or nothing type of mentality. All right. Again, it promotes free will, positive view of human nature, and then hierarchy needs group therapy. Okay. All right. Cognitive psychology. Combination of the previous two, behaviorism and humanistic psychology. It studies the mental processes. This is probably the more important point right here when it comes to assessments rather than this one. Students miss this question a lot for some reason. Right? It'll ask, what is the psych perspective that focuses on the mental processes? And the answer is cognitive psychology. Okay? Cognitions and mental processes are really terminology that we should use interchangeably. Right? So what are some of the mental processes? The basics would be like intelligence or memory or language or sequencing, even sensing, perception. Those are cognitions. Right? So perception is huge. You may want to emphasize perception with cognitive psychology. Okay? There are two subcategories of cognitive psychology. The one that we're going to emphasize is Gestalt psychology. There's this other idea, information processing theory. Again, a subcategory of cognitive psychology. So this kind of gives you an idea of the time period in which this approach is developing. It goes along with computers. It makes a metaphor to the brain and computers. It says the brain is like a computer. With the information processing theory. And you guys probably don't, some of your Chromebooks, I'm surprised Jobs doesn't do this, right? But if you get too many programs going on, some of the older computers, what would happen? It crashes. Does yours ever crash? It should. It should crash, and it should operate really slow because you got so many programs going on, right? But that happened all the time in our older computers that we had. You never wanted to run two programs at a time because it just slowed everything way down. So the idea is that the theory behind this was that our brain was like that. And if our brain gets overwhelmed by too much stimuli, what happens is we shut down. We have like a seizure because of that. Okay, so that was the idea. But then as computers started to progress, and we could start running multiple programs at the same time without shutting down, they changed the information processing theory. They said that our brain is like that, right? That we can juggle multiple concepts at the same time as well. Right? Yep.
Cognitive psychology is a combination of what?
The previous two. So it would be humanistic and behaviorism. Humanistic and behaviorism. All right, let's think about Gestalt for a moment. Gestalt is a German word that means whole. Again, that's spelled W-H-O-L-E. Whole or pattern. Whole or pattern. Really want to emphasize that you have that in mind. Gestalt, German word, means whole or pattern. Essentially what Gestalt psychology is looking at is how our brain fills in the blanks for us, fills in the gaps. A lot of times we don't have to see the entire picture and we can figure stuff out really fast, right? Because of that method by which our brain operates, we can live a much more efficient life. There are tons and tons of benefits because our brain works like that. Sound good? However, there are some times in which, because our brain fills in the blanks, we get easily fooled, right? Because it fills in the blanks in an incorrect manner sometimes, okay? So I'll give you some examples here in a second. Actually, the phi phenomenon is the basis, the foundation for this idea of Gestalt psychology. What is the phi phenomenon? I usually describe it as Christmas lights. Christmas lights. Okay? You ever go to that Christmas lights show over in East Peoria? Ever done that before? So essentially what Christmas lights are is you have a light going on and another light going off, right? And then when this one goes off, this one comes on. And if you step back from it, it looks like movement, right? Because our brain is filling in the blanks, but it's really just lights going off and on, okay? So that's essentially what the phi phenomenon is. They had an experiment. They brought subjects into the room. They blacked out all the lights. They had them stand on one side of the wall, and then one light came on this side of the room, Okay? And as soon as that light went off, another light on the opposite end of the room came on. Right? And then it would just go back and forth. And for the subjects that were watching this, they didn't necessarily perceive it as two separate lights going on and off. They perceived it as a beam of light going back and forth. Right? Now, was there an actual beam going back and forth? There wasn't. But their brain was filling in the gaps, filling the blanks. Same thing here. Right? If you really, kind of look at it, look away, and then look back at it, it kind of looks like the ball is actually jumping back and forth. Right? Our brain is trying to fill in the blanks for us, but it's actually just two red balls going on and off that way. Okay? If you look at this long enough, it almost seems like it's coming at you or there's some type of movement. Your brain is trying to figure out reference points. And in that process, fill in the gaps. And then eventually it creates movement because of that. Okay? Again, that's all because of Gestalt psychology. Okay, let's get past that. We already talked about that. This is actually Gestalt psychology as well, even though it says information processing theory. So when we look at words, they don't actually have to be spelled correctly. They just have to have the letters in them. Maybe the first and last one. Okay, candy tastes delicious, school's awesome, classroom rocks. Right? Imagine if this wasn't the case. Imagine if we had to look at each and every letter and break it down in order for us to read something. Would you want to read anything? No, it'd take too much mental effort to do it. So it would be extremely frustrating. Can't mention Preston's name anymore. Little kids, when they start to read, it's very frustrating to try to teach them how to read, right? Because they're breaking each and every letter down, right? You're just like, say the word. Say the word. These are some of the advantages of cognitive psychology. The most important one is this one here. Today, it's one of the most prominent schools of thought today. So, Ms. Ferry, you asked yesterday which one's right, right? A lot of psychologists are going to approach studying human behavior with this one, more so than any other right now. Okay? So, some good stuff with cognitive psychology. Does anybody have any questions about Gestalt psychology? Information processing. There isn't necessarily, all the others I've had psychologists. There's a guy named Robert Sternberg that does a study on emotions and love. We kind of consider him to be a cognitive psychologist. We'll talk about him later on with the triangular theory of love there. I was trying to think of one more. Ekman, you could probably say that Ekman, the guy with the facial feedback hypothesis guy, you could probably classify him as a cognitive psychologist as well. All right. If nothing else, I'll let you guys hang out for the last few moments.